Imagine waking up to find out that the government is taking your land, your home, your family's inheritance, and they're not offering a cent in return. It sounds like a horror story, right? But this idea is called expropriation without compensation. It isn't just a theory, it's a real debate in South Africa. But how real is the threat, and can it actually happen to you? Because in this video, I'm going to break down exactly what's true, what's fear-mongering, and how to protect your properties from being taken.
We should no longer be afraid of this process of having to change the land ownership architecture in our country. It is here and it is here to stay. It is going to happen.
Stick around because here's what I'm covering in this video. And if you stay to the end, I'll also give you one trick most people don't know that can help protect their property. So what is expropriation without compensation? Expropriation without compensation, or EWC, is the idea that the state can take land or property without paying the owner. This usually happens in the name of public interest like land reform. But it's not as simple as the government takes whatever it wants, because that's not how it works legally, and the law still requires due process. The concept, however, was introduced to address inequality in land ownership, especially from apartheid, but the key debate is whether the state should pay when taking the land. In some cases, the argument is that the compensation should be zero. This is super scary if you think about it. So not everyone is at risk. Let's be clear about that, because the biggest risks are for people who own unused or abandoned land, a property with no formal title deed, or large farms or land acquired through historic land dispossession. Here's a real example. So in Limpopo, the government tried to expropriate land that was idle for over 10 years, but the owner had proof of development plans and intentions, and the case was dropped. The lesson here is, if you own land, document your use, your plans or efforts, even if development hasn't actually started, because that paper trail is what's going to matter most. I'm going to share on screen a screenshot of risk levels of different properties in South Africa, and this should give you some confidence that the residential market or the investment part of property is generally safe. The main concern is going to be unused or abandoned land, land without formal title deeds, large commercial farms, informal settlements or unregistered land, or urban land owned by abandoned landlords. So let's talk about the law. Section 25 of the Constitution, also called the Property Clause, says property can only be taken for a public purpose, in the public's interest, and subject to compensation. However, there's been a push to amend this to allow certain properties to be taken away without any payment. But even with that push, the Constitution still prohibits arbitrary deprivation of property, which means that the state must follow proper legal processes. In 2021, Parliament tried to pass a bill to make expropriation without compensation more explicit in the law, but guess what? It failed. So the Constitution still holds that land expropriation must be for a public purpose or interest with just and equitable compensation, and it does not explicitly allow null or zero compensation. However, it's also true that Parliament later passed the Separate Expropriation Act of 2024, which includes provisions that under limited circumstances, null or zero compensation may be considered just and equitable. That act was signed by the President in January 2025, but it does not change the Constitution, and its provisions have yet to come into operation. So with the scary part out of the way, I've heard people say, why would you invest in property in South Africa? Because the government is just going to take it away. Personally, I continuously invest in residential property in South Africa, and I believe that the property in South Africa is some of the best deals that you can find all around the world, and that's why so many people from overseas or internationally invest in South Africa, because of these opportunities. So don't be afraid of investing in property in South Africa just because your friend or your neighbor talked about EWC in South Africa. So let's clear up some myths that are flying around social media at this stage. The first myth is that the government can just take land tomorrow. That is false, because there must be a legal justification, due process, and usually a court is involved. Myth 2 is they are only targeting white-owned land. This is also wrong, because the policy is not race-based, though land reform does address historical imbalances. Myth number 3 is you can't fight it in court. This is also false, because in fact multiple cases have been stopped because landowners challenged them legally and actually won. Now here's something that rarely gets mentioned. You're also protected under the law called the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, and this law says that if the government makes a decision that affects your rights, like taking your land randomly, that process must be fair, transparent, and legally justified at the end of the day. If it's not, you can challenge them in court and potentially stop the entire expropriation. So here's how smart investors add protection layers to their properties. They own properties through a trust or a company, because this can slow down the expropriation attempt. You can also make your land productive. Even just small scale activity or leasing to a tenant will be fine. You also need to keep records, plans, applications, business use, or any farming activity, because all of this will help as a paper trail. These steps won't make you immune, but they buy you time and legal options. I think it comes down to making sure you take the necessary steps to protect yourself as far as you possibly can. For me, I like to set up the right structures. I need to be protected if something had to happen in the future, and I also focus on buying the right type of properties. At the end of the day, it seems like land specifically is where most of the risk sits, and this is unfortunately just it's how it works. So residential property, investment type properties like apartments, townhouses, or residential properties overall seems to be much less at risk compared to vacant land, abandoned land, or big large commercial farms. And unfortunately, people that do own those type of land or properties might have to make sure that they can protect themselves in a few other ways as well. So at the end of the day, if you have the right structures and you use debt and you buy the right type of properties, I feel that there's not a lot of risk involved as an investor. But there will always be risk involved with farmland. Now, let me flip this around, and if you're a low-income earner using programs like FLIS or buying government subsidy homes, you are not the government's target. In fact, you're actually helping solve the housing crisis, and those type of properties are far less likely to be affected by EWC. So don't let fear stop you from building wealth, and understand the law, stay informed, and play the game smart. Now that you know how expropriation without compensation really works, you're already ahead of most property owners in South Africa. If this video helped you out in any way, make sure to check out my FLIS subsidy video, where I show you how you can buy property with little or even a low income in South Africa.